Just a nurse, they called her. That's all anyone at Oak Creek Memorial knew. Katie Rodriguez, night shift, 3 weeks in, the quiet one who never joined the staff lunches in the cafeteria, never laughed at the residents' jokes, never lingered at the nurse's station making small talk. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like a mechanical heartbeat as she clocked in at 18:13, her badge hanging from a plain grey lanyard. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable. Her shoes were white, pristine. Nobody looked twice at her. What they didn't know was that those hands, the ones inserting fours with impossible precision, muscle memory from 1,000 combat procedures in a theater of war they couldn't imagine, had held dying men together with nothing but gauze and determination. What they didn't see was the way her jaw clenched every time a helicopter passed over Raleigh, the slight tremor in her left hand that appeared only on nights when the wind carried that particular whump-whump-whump sound through the hospital walls. What they absolutely didn't notice was the faded patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, hanging in her locker in the staff room, a small square of fabric from a green beret unit, faded to the color of old photographs, the only kept memorial to a life she'd deliberately buried 18 months ago. Katie moved through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like a ghost moving through walls. Efficient. Silent. Present but invisible. The night shift had a different rhythm than the days, slower, more isolated. Fewer attendants, fewer visitors, fewer eyes. The hospital at night felt like a ship running on a skeleton crew, and she preferred it that way. Fewer people meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant she could exist in the margins, doing her work, going home, and pretending the nightmares from Ramadi would eventually stop coming. She reached the nurse's station just as the evening shift was preparing to brief the night team. The station smelled like cold coffee and the sharp chemical bite of hand sanitizer. Her charge nurse, Margaret, was updating the census board with red dry erase marker, her movements practiced and tired. She'd been here 12 years. She didn't ask Katie personal questions anymore, had learned within the first week that "how was your night?" got a nod and nothing more. "Rodriguez," Margaret said without turning. "You've got 6 beds. Post-ops in for 12, 414. Cardiac rehab in 408. 2 med-surg in for 16, 418. Trauma follow-up in 410. Nothing critical expected. Night should be quiet." "Copy," Katie said. Copy. A word from another life, one she was supposed to have left behind. She caught herself, reset her voice. "Understood. I'll check the charts." Margaret handed over the shift report clipboard, and Katie took it with both hands, fingers steady now. The tremor was gone. It only came when she wasn't thinking about controlling it. Consciousness was armor. She'd learned that a long time ago, in a different uniform, in a place where the air itself felt like it was burning. The night stretched ahead, predictable and manageable. Katie pushed a med cart down the dim corridor to begin her rounds. The hallway was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors from the rooms, a rhythmic percussion that had become almost meditative. Room for 12. A woman post-op from hip replacement, sleeping fitfully under the pale glow of a nightlight. Katie checked the foresight without waking her, confirmed the fluid drip rate was correct, adjusted the blanket. 12 seconds per room if everything was normal. She'd timed it. By 22:30, the hospital had settled into its night rhythm. Fewer staff moving through the halls. The cafeteria was closed. The administrative offices upstairs were dark. Katie had completed her initial rounds and now sat at the nurse's station reviewing charts in the fluorescent glare, her attention fixed on the computer screen with a kind of intensity that would have been notable to anyone watching. But nobody was watching. Not yet. She reviewed the patient records with the precision of someone trained to identify patterns others missed. Her eyes moved across billing codes, medication orders, lab results. The work was routine, medication times, vital sign documentation, post-operative protocols. Except it wasn't routine. Not entirely. In patient 412's chart, there was a billing code for a cardiac imaging study that hadn't been ordered. In patient for 14, a notation for an unnecessary laboratory panel, redundant testing done just 5 days earlier. Info 16, an antibiotic prescribed at double the standard dose with no documented clinical justification. Small things. The kind of things that slip past busy nurses who trust that doctors know what they're doing. The kind of things that only stand out to someone with the particular kind of attention that comes from having spent years in environments where details mean the difference between life and death. Katie's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could flag these. She could escalate them. That would be the right thing to do. That would also make her visible, draw attention, create questions. So instead, she opened a blank document on her personal phone, old habit, never use hospital systems for anything you wanted to keep private, and began typing notes. Dates. Patient names. Billing codes. Peculiarities. Just documenting what she saw. Not making accusations. Just noticing. The clock on the wall read 23:44 when Dr. Hargrove swept into the nurse's station. He had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Expensive cologne first, something that cost more than Katie's monthly rent, she'd guess. Then the man himself, tailored white coat over a designer suit, a watch that caught the light like it was worth more than a car, salt and pepper hair styled with the kind of precision that took time and money to maintain. He was chief of medicine at Oak Creek Memorial, the kind of doctor who made rounds at midnight because that's when important doctors did things, when they could be observed being important. Hargrove's eyes swept across the nurse's station and landed on Katie. She felt his gaze the way you feel a predator's attention, a shift in the thermal landscape. She didn't look up from her screen. Still working. His voice was the kind of smooth that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. Dedication is admirable. Inefficiency, less so. Charts need review, Katie said. She didn't elaborate. Didn't add qualifiers or apologies. Just statement of fact. Of course they do. Hargrove moved closer, and she caught the full weight of his attention now. He was watching her hands on the keyboard, the way her eyes moved across the screen, the absolute absence of any nervous energy. Most people got nervous when Dr. Hargrove stood near them. Something about his presence seemed to demand deference. Katie simply continued her work. 3 weeks now, yes? How are you settling in? Fine, thank you. Not joining the staff events. Margaret mentioned you're solitary. Some might call that antisocial. Katie's fingers paused for exactly 1 beat. Then resumed typing. I work nights. Difficult to attend day events. Hargrove smiled. The smile of a man who knows he's right about something and is amused by everyone else's ignorance. Yes, well, some people are simply meant for solitude. Quieter types. Less equipped for the complexity of patient care, despite what they might imagine. He straightened his coat, confirmed his watch was still catching the light correctly. Do try not to stay too late. We wouldn't want you making mistakes. He left the nurse's station as smoothly as he'd entered, and Katie heard the soft sound of his footsteps moving toward the elevators. She returned to her screen, returned to her documentation, her breathing steady and even. Her jaw was clenched tight enough to ache, but her hands didn't shake. They never shook in public. That was a rule. The tremor was for helicopters and dark mornings and 3 a.m. when she was alone with the memory of Ramadi. At 1:15, Katie stood and stretched her shoulders. The night shift was sliding toward its quiet middle hours, the time when nothing happened if nothing was going to happen. She walked to the staff locker room, where the ambient temperature felt suddenly cooler, more private. Her locker was in the corner, unmarked except for her name printed on a label in Margaret's careful handwriting. Katie opened it and looked at her jacket hanging inside, folded neatly over her street clothes and civilian shoes. She reached out and touched the lining, felt the small raised patch sewn deep inside where no one would ever see it. The fabric was worn, faded to a color between gray and green, barely holding its shape anymore. 20 years it had lived in her jacket lining. 20 years since Ramadi. 20 years since she'd sewn it there with hands that were still learning to shake. Marcus. That's who it belonged to, or more accurately, that's who it had belonged to. Master Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, 5th Special Forces Group, Green Beret, her husband of 7 years before an IED took his convoy somewhere in Helmand Province that she wasn't supposed to know about. The patch from his unit had been in his gear. She'd kept it instead of his ashes. Kept it, sewn it into her jacket lining, carried it through a civilian life where no one knew she'd ever been anything but a nurse. Katie's fingers traced the edge of the patch, and for just a moment, her composure cracked. For just a moment, there was a tremor. Not in her hands this time, but in her chest, that old familiar ache of carrying something heavy for so long that you forgot what it felt like to put it down. And then a helicopter passed overhead, cutting through the night sky somewhere above Raleigh. The whump 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 sound rattled the windows of the locker room, and Katie's hands began to shake. She pulled them back, composed them, breathed through it. This was what the nightmares looked like in the daytime. This was why she'd come to Oak Creek Memorial, why she'd chosen the night shift, why she'd become invisible. She was trying to start over. That was all. Just trying to be someone new, someone whose only trauma was the standard weight of hospital work. Someone whose hand shook for normal reasons. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the woman she'd been before, the one with the military rank and the combat certifications and the 1,000 procedures performed under fire, that woman was still here, still present, still watching everything with the precision of a predator who'd learned to hunt in a desert that tried to kill you every single day. Katie closed her locker carefully, buttoned her jacket over the patch that only she knew was there, and walked back toward the patient floors. The night had 4 more hours to run. The charts would still need checking. The patterns would still be there, hidden in the billing codes and the unnecessary procedures and the small inconsistencies that nobody else was trained to see. She had documentation to complete. And somewhere in this hospital, there was a doctor who didn't understand that the quiet ones, the invisible ones, were often the most dangerous. The packed nurses' station smelled like burnt coffee and urgency, the fluorescent lights casting everyone in that particular shade of institutional pallor that came with the morning shift change. Katie Rodriguez moved through the crowd with the kind of invisibility that only came from being new, competent, and quiet. She didn't belong here yet. Everyone knew it. She was filing a lab result when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. "I'll bet $50 Rodriguez here doesn't last the month." He didn't look at Katie when he said it. Didn't need to. The laughter rippled through the station in waves, predictable, practiced, the kind that had been working for him for years. New girls never do. Especially the quiet ones who think they're too good to socialize. More laughter. Someone bumped Katie's shoulder in what might have been camaraderie or might have been a test. Katie continued filing the lab result. One measured breath. Her pen didn't shake. She'd weathered worse than this. Mortar fire had a way of putting a $50 bet into perspective, but Hargrove didn't know that. Nobody here knew that. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining stayed exactly where it belonged, hidden. A memorial to Marcus. A ghost from another life. She turned a page in the chart. Another breath. The laughter faded as the attention shifted. This was stage 1, social attack, public mockery, the setup where the predator tests whether the prey would run. Katie wouldn't run. She never ran. But Hargrove didn't know that either. 3 days later, Katie stood in the hospital cafeteria holding a tray of lukewarm soup and overcooked vegetables. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above her head. She'd spent the previous night reviewing patient charts, her habit, her compulsion, the thing that kept her awake past midnight. That's when she'd noticed the pattern. Master Sergeant Cole Brennan admitted 2 days ago with respiratory distress from a training exercise gone wrong. Green Beret insignia on his chart. Her hands had stopped moving when she saw that. The same unit. The same insignia that was sewn inside her jacket. She hadn't let herself think about it. Thinking led to remembering. Remembering led to Ramadi. But the charts were another matter entirely. Hargrove had ordered a cardiac catheterization on Cole, unnecessary, by every clinical measure. The patient's heart was stable. His troponin levels were normal. His ejection fraction showed no compromise. The order didn't fit the presentation. It didn't fit anything except one thing, the billing code that came with it. A code that Katie had seen 7 times in the past 3 weeks. 7 unnecessary procedures routed through Hargrove's department. 7 patterns that added up to something that made her stomach clench. She approached him near the salad station where he was arranging a plate with the precision of someone who'd never worked a 12-hour shift and forgotten to eat. She kept her voice level, professional, the voice of someone asking a genuine clinical question. Dr. Hargrove, I wanted to check on the cardiac catheterization order for Master Sergeant Brennan in room for 12. She held the revised charts in her hands, her notes, her concerns, documented with the precision of someone who'd spent 18 years learning to leave a paper trail that couldn't be disputed. His presentation doesn't support the procedure. Troponin negative, ejection fraction 55%, no chest pain or arrhythmia. Could we consider a second opinion from cardiology before? The tray left her hands before she finished the sentence. Coffee exploded across the tile floor in a fan of brown liquid that spread like a stain. Soup splattered her scrubs. The plate clattered and broke into 3 pieces. Hargrove's hand came up almost casually, a flick of the wrist, the kind of gesture that looked accidental if you weren't paying attention. He wasn't paying attention. He was looking at her with something that might have been rage or might have been contempt, and he threw her charts down on top of the mess, paper scattering across the tile like leaves. Pick that up, sweetheart, and learn your place. His voice was low, conversational, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. I don't take medical advice from glorified pill pushers. The cafeteria went silent. 50 eyes turned in unison. A resident froze mid-bite. One of the food service workers looked at the floor and suddenly found his shoes very interesting. This was what power looked like, not the kind written down in a hospital org chart, but the real kind. The kind that came from knowing that no one in this room had more leverage than he did. The kind that came from knowing the board members' cell phone numbers. Katie knelt to gather the charts. The soup was still warm against her scrubs. She could feel it cooling, congealing. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision, each page collected, each page squared off against her palm. One tear escaped down her cheek. Just one. She didn't try to stop it. She held Hargrove's gaze the entire time, her eyes locked on his while the tear tracked down her face, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. One measured breath. The kind of breath that came from training, from discipline, from 18 years of learning how to compartmentalize fear into something manageable. A good doctor wouldn't be afraid of a second opinion, she said quietly. Her voice sounded strange in the silence, steady, but with an undertone of something else. Something that made Hargrove's jaw clench. He leaned down, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and suffocating. You're making a mistake, Mouse, he said, using the nickname he'd started with, a thing designed to diminish her, to make her small. I built this department. I can make you disappear just like you came in. Nobody will remember your name. Katie rose to her feet, the wet charts pressed against her scrubs. She didn't respond. She simply walked past him toward the trash can, disposed of the broken plate, and left the cafeteria without looking back. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the ambient noise of the cafeteria resumed, forks clicking against plates, conversations restarting as if nothing had happened. As if a doctor hadn't just knocked a tray from a nurse's hands in front of 50 witnesses. As if no one had seen it. That evening, Katie sat alone in the hospital break room with her phone in her hand and the door locked. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless song. On the small table in front of her lay 3 patient charts, all in Hargrove's handwriting. The cardiac catheterization for Cole, unnecessary, the numbers didn't support it. 2 exploratory endoscopies for stable patients with no GI symptoms. An MRI follow-up for a patient whose initial scan had shown nothing. 7 procedures total when she looked at the pattern across the past 3 weeks. 7 billing codes routed through Hargrove's service line. 7 opportunities for kickback payments that would flow to anyone who'd invested in the right pharmaceutical company or imaging center. Her hands trembled as she photographed the first chart. Not from fear. From rage. From the kind of controlled tremor that came from knowing something was wrong and not being able to do anything about it yet. She'd seen this before, not in hospitals, but in combat zones. The kind of systematic theft that built on itself, that relied on people being too afraid or too tired to question it. She photographed the second chart. The third. The camera flash was bright in the empty break room. When she was done, she sat in the silence and let her hand shake openly, her fist clenched around the phone. There was a pattern here. An architecture of fraud that went deeper than one doctor's greed. But she didn't have proof yet. Not the kind that would hold up against someone like Hargrove, who had board members on speed dial and favor banks 3 accounts deep. She pulled her jacket from the locker and found the patch inside the lining where it had been sewn for 20 years. The fabric was faded now, the green worn to something closer to gray. A unit insignia from the 5th Special Forces Group. Her husband's unit. The one that had saved that 8-year-old Iraqi boy in Ramadi when she'd thrown her body over him during mortar fire and whispered, "I've got you, baby, I've got you." She'd never known what happened to him after that day. Never learned if he survived beyond the immediate moment. Never knew if her intervention had meant anything or if he died weeks later anyway, the way so many of them did. But Cole Brennan's chart had that same insignia. That same unit. And the coincidence of it, a patient from her past, if he was even her patient at all, arriving in her hospital under a doctor who was systematically ordering unnecessary procedures, felt like more than chance. It felt like something the universe was showing her. A test, maybe. Or a trap. She touched the patch once, fingers lingering on the faded fabric, and then she locked her jacket back in the locker. The break room was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant beeping of monitors from the ICU down the hall. She had 2 options now: walk away, become the quiet invisible nurse, let Hargrove keep building his empire on the backs of patients who couldn't fight back. Or she could push further, gather more documentation, build a case so airtight that even someone like Hargrove couldn't survive it. She knew which one she would choose. She'd always known. The intercom crackled at 14:37. Trauma alert. Incoming transport, ETA for minutes. GSW to left thorax, respiratory compromise, alert and oriented ×3. Katie didn't look up from the chart she was reviewing, Cole Brennan's chart, the patient in 412 who'd arrived 6 hours ago with a history of combat-related injury and intermittent shortness of breath. The paramedic note was sparse. No name, no service record, nothing that would explain why her hands had gone cold when she first saw him in the bay. 38 years old. Former military. Came through the ER with a cough and a story about old wounds catching up. She'd maintained her distance, professional composure, checking vitals and saying nothing while her pulse hammered behind her ribs like a fist against a locked door. The ambulance bay doors hissed open. Boots on tile. Multiple voices, controlled urgency. The kind of coordination that came from people who'd done this before, under fire, when mistakes meant bodies. Katie moved to the supply cart without consciously deciding to, her hands already assembling what she knew they'd need: oxygen, the crash cart within arm's reach, the defibrillator pads on the corner of the trauma bed. Muscle memory from a life she'd buried. Dr. Hargrove was already in the bay, barking orders with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. Get 2 large-bore 4s. Type and cross-match for 6 units. Prep for imaging. He didn't acknowledge Katie. He never did unless it was to diminish. The patient rolled in on the stretcher, a man in his 50s, breathing in shallow gasps, his left side wrapped in field dressing that had already soaked through with blood. The paramedics had done their job, the airway was patent, oxygen flowing at 15 liters, vitals crashing. 108 systolic, heart rate 142, the lead paramedic called out. Decreased breath sounds on the left. Trachea shifted maybe a finger breadth to the right. We got 2 liters in en route. That was the clue. Tracheal deviation. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung, collapsing the vessels, suffocating the patient from inside out. Katie watched Hargrove's face as he listened. No immediate reaction. No recognition of the presentation. He was already thinking imaging, CT scan, the interventional suite, procedures that would take time and generate billing codes. The kind of high-dollar pathway that paid for his 6-bedroom colonial in North Hills and his ex-wife's alimony. "Let's get him upstairs," Hargrove said. "Radiology first, then cardiothoracic consult." The patient's oxygen saturation was already dropping. 94, 91. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia pushing into the 150s, the rhythm of a body drowning in its own cavity. Katie moved like she was floating, watching herself from somewhere outside her skin, the way combat medics learn to do when the ground beneath them might explode. She positioned herself at the patient's left side, her fingers finding the anatomical landmarks, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her calloused fingertips, hands that had held the dying in places where nobody came to help, registered the subtle landmark that would be the difference between this man's next breath and his last. Immediate imaging might not get him there, Katie said. Her voice didn't waver. It never did. O2 sat dropping fast. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He didn't like correction. He especially didn't like it from a nurse who'd begun asking questions about his billing codes. "We follow protocol, Nurse Rodriguez." The imaging. "The imaging kills him," Katie interrupted. Calm. Measured. A statement of fact. Tension pneumo. "He needs decompression now." The silence that followed was so thick you could have operated in it. The paramedics exchanged glances. The respiratory therapist paused mid-movement. And Hargrove's face went the color of a sunset before a storm. "That's not your call to make," he said, each word dropping like a hammer. "You don't have the authority." The patient's oxygen saturation hit 82. Then 78. The monitor's beeping accelerated into a sound like a scream made of electricity. Katie's hand moved. Not rebellious. Not insubordinate. Automatic. The 14-gauge needle was already out, the alcohol pad already swiping, muscle memory guiding her with the kind of precision that only comes from having done it when people were dying around you and you were the only one who could make it stop. The needle went in between the ribs, past the intercostal muscles, through the fascia, there. The hiss of air escaping. Compressed lung re-expanding. Pressure equalizing. 85. 90. 93. Climbing. "We need a chest tube before transfer," Katie said. "Dr. Shaw in thoracic can do it when he gets here." The room went still. The patient was breathing easier now, color returning to his ashen face. His oxygen saturation stabilized at 94 and held steady. Sinus rhythm. Not perfect, but sustainable. Alive. Dr. Hargrove stared at Katie with an expression that moved through surprise, then humiliation, then something darker, something that looked like calculation wearing a mask of fury. "Get him to ICU," he said finally, not to Katie. Never directly to Katie. "I want a full workup. And someone call HR. I want documentation of what just happened here." He left the trauma bay without another word, and Katie didn't watch him go. She was already checking the decompression site, already monitoring the monitor, already being invisible again, just the competent nurse doing her job, not the senior chief petty officer who'd remembered how to save lives in the middle of chaos. But she knew. The way you know a wave is coming before it breaks. This was different from the cafeteria humiliation. This was Hargrove's face when his dominance had been challenged in front of witnesses. This was a man who couldn't afford to have his competence questioned. Not because of ego was easy to manage, but because of what those questions might uncover. She finished her documentation at 16:22, standard protocol entries, nothing that would draw attention. Blood pressure. Heart rate. Breath sounds. Oxygen saturation response to intervention. All facts. All documented. All defensible. By 1715, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Administrative office, 3rd floor, now. The corridor from the ICU to administration moved like a tunnel, fluorescent panels casting everything in the kind of light that made human skin look transparent. Her badge clipped to her pocket felt heavier than usual. The unit patch underneath her scrubs, sewn into the jacket lining she kept in her locker, seemed to pulse against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The administrative office was all dark wood and failure, the kind of space designed to intimidate. Hargrove was already there with Helen Marsh, the outside investigator, the kind of professional problem solver that hospitals called when they needed a narrative to fit a conclusion they'd already reached. Nurse Rodriguez, Helen said, extending a hand like they were meeting at a conference. Professional. Polished. Dr. Hargrove has brought some concerns to my attention regarding protocol violations and scope of practice issues. I'd like to discuss those with you. Katie didn't sit. Standing gave her an advantage, a baseline to push off from if she needed to move. What concerns? The needle decompression, Helen said, pulling out a tablet. Already taking notes. Already documenting her version of events. Dr. Hargrove indicates you performed a procedure beyond nursing scope without physician authorization. That's a significant issue. The patient was decompensating, Katie said. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression is emergency intervention. Any trained combat medic. Combat medic. Helen's fingers paused. You have combat medical training. The trap had already been set. Katie could see it. Hargrove was watching her from across the desk like a man who'd just realized he was playing poker against someone who'd memorized the deck. Current CPR certification, Katie corrected, her voice never changing. Standard protocol for emergency nursing response. I see, Helen said, but her tablet was already recording something different. Already building a file that would say Katie Rodriguez had overstated her qualifications, that she'd acted outside her scope, that she'd contradicted physician authority in a way that endangered rather than helped the patient. We'll need to speak with your previous employers. Can you provide references? Katie already knew what would happen next. She'd known since the moment Hargrove's face had gone dark in the trauma bay. 1, she said. 3 years ago. Before that is personal time. Personal time. The gap she'd never explained to anyone. The years she'd spent learning how to be invisible, how to be just a nurse, how to live in a life where nobody expected her to be anyone important or dangerous or qualified to make life and death decisions on her own authority. Helen was already typing. We'll need to contact them. Verify your claims about your training and background. Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just realized his opponent had walked into a corner. The next words out of his mouth changed everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Ms. Marsh will be documenting this matter thoroughly, Hargrove said. In the meantime, Nurse Rodriguez, I'm recommending you be removed from critical care rotation pending investigation. We take patient safety very seriously at Oak Creek Memorial. We can't have nurses practicing beyond their scope. Katie's jaw tightened. One measured breath. But she said nothing, knowing that anything she said would be twisted and documented and used against her. Knowing that Hargrove had already called his friends. The board members who owed him favors. The ones whose children had received substantial donations to elite universities. The ones whose country club memberships had been mysteriously upgraded without additional dues. She left the office at 17:08, and by 18:30, Hargrove had made his calls. 3 of them. To board members who answered on the first ring and listened while he explained that a problematic staff member was asking questions about billing procedures and now she'd performed an unauthorized medical intervention that could have caused serious liability. The calls took 17 minutes total. By 18:06, those board members had already begun making calls of their own. To the hospital CEO. To the legal department. To Helen Marsh with additional instructions about the documentation that needed to happen. By 1915, Katie's sparse employment references were being contacted. The last place she'd worked before Oak Creek Memorial, a rural clinic in Georgia where nobody knew her, where her supervisor had already retired and left no forwarding information. No character witnesses. No one to say she'd been anything other than a competent nurse who showed up and did her job. And in room for 12 of Oak Creek Memorial, Cole Brennan lay in the ICU bed with his oxygen saturation stable at 96, his heart rate down to 88, breathing easier than he had in 6 hours, all because of the intervention that was currently being documented as reckless and dangerous. He was getting better. That was the problem. A patient who improved under simple conservative care and emergency response was a patient who didn't need the expensive interventions Hargrove had planned. As Katie left the hospital at 2022, stepping into the rain that had begun to fall over Raleigh like a soft accusation, she didn't know that Cole Brennan was beginning to remember. Didn't know that his clarity was returning along with his oxygen saturation. Didn't know that memories were surfacing, faces, moments, a young woman in a helmet and body armor throwing herself over a terrified boy during a mortar attack 20 years ago in a place called Ramadi. Didn't know that in less than 24 hours, everything would change. What she did know was that the trap had closed. The documentation was already beginning. The narrative was already being shaped. And somewhere in the machinery of institutional power, Dr. Hargrove was smiling, confident in the knowledge that he'd neutralized the threat to his financial security. He had no idea who he was standing next to. 4:30 in the morning. The kind of dark that exists only in hospitals, fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of green and gray, the world reduced to vital signs and the soft beeping of machines that never sleep. Katie moved through pre-dawn rounds with the invisible grace of someone who'd spent 2 decades moving through spaces where being noticed could get you killed. Room for 12. Room for 13. Room for 14. Cole Brennan's bed was empty when she arrived, just rumpled sheets and the faint indent of a head on the pillow. He'd been stable at midnight. She'd checked his chart herself, traced the medication orders with the precision of someone reading for lies, and found nothing remarkable except the absence of anything at all, a patient recovering from a routine cardiac workup, scheduled for his morning catheterization at 6. The screaming started from somewhere down the hall. Not words. Just sound, raw, animal, the kind of noise that meant the body was failing faster than the mind could process. Katie didn't run. She walked. Fast, economical movements, every muscle remembering protocols that had nothing to do with civilian nursing. The code team was already moving when she reached room for 18, but they moved like actors in a rehearsal, going through motions without urgency. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen in the doorway, his face the color of old plaster. Cole Brennan was in catastrophic respiratory distress. His chest heaved against gravity itself, struggling, each breath a war with air that wouldn't come. His neck was twisted at an angle that shouldn't exist in a living human, tracheal deviation, the windpipe shifted from pressure building on the wrong side of his chest. His right side was silent. No breath sounds. Just the terrible absence of air moving where it should move, his oxygen saturation already plummeting past 80, 70, 60. The monitor screamed in electronic panic. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped between the lung and the chest wall, building pressure with every breath, collapsing the lung, pushing the heart toward the left, crushing the vessels that kept blood flowing to the brain. Every second the pressure increased. Every second his heart had less room to beat. Every second his oxygen fell like a stone dropping through black water. The code team was calling for equipment. Someone was reaching for the defibrillator pads. Someone else was fumbling with an oxygen mask. Nobody was doing the one thing that would save his life in the next 60 seconds. Katie moved. She didn't ask. Didn't announce herself. Didn't wait for permission from a man who was staring at this patient like he was watching someone else's nightmare. Her hands opened the crash cart, muscle memory made fluid, made certain. The 14-gauge needle was where it always was. Angiocath. 2.5 inches of salvation if she got it right, instant death if she got it wrong. Cole's chest was bare. She found the landmarks without thinking, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the place between the ribs where air escape meant life continued. Her left hand stabilized his chest. Her right positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle, perpendicular to the ribs. One motion. Clean. Definitive. No hesitation, because hesitation was the enemy of the dying. The needle went in. The hiss came next, compressed air escaping like a breath held for too long finally released. Like a tire deflating. Like pressure transforming into possibility. Oxygen saturation stopped falling. 45 millimeters of mercury of pressure transformed into zero, transformed into survival. Cole's color shifted from purple-gray to something resembling human. His breathing became air instead of drowning. The monitor slowed its frantic screaming to something almost musical. Code team arrived 3 minutes later to find a patient already stabilized, already breathing, already alive because a quiet nurse had done in 5 seconds what a frozen doctor couldn't do in 5 minutes. Dr. Hargrove's face transformed. The shock drained away. Replaced by something worse. Something that looked like rage wearing a suit made of administrative authority. He watched Katie step back from the crash cart, watched her place the needle on the tray with the precision of someone returning a weapon to its armory. He didn't say anything in that moment. He just watched. The way a predator watches a smaller animal that suddenly reveals teeth. Within 2 hours, the incident report was filed. Within 4, every board member with a country club membership was receiving calls. Within 6, an outside investigator arrived with a notepad and questions designed to frame heroism as recklessness. Katie sat in Helen Marsh's office at noon. The administrator wouldn't make eye contact. Her hands moved papers around on her desk like she was trying to physically distance herself from what she was about to say. The incident report indicates you performed a medical procedure without physician authorization, Helen said. Emergency needle decompression. That's beyond the scope of nursing practice, Katie. You know that. Katie's hands rested on her thighs. Steady. Still. The patient was in cardiac arrest. Which is exactly why protocols exist. To protect patients. To protect us. Helen slid a suspension notice across the desk. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation. You have 72 hours before this becomes permanent termination. The words didn't land like words. They landed like geography, the sudden realization that the ground you were standing on had never been solid at all. Katie read the document. Her name in official font. The charge. The potential consequences. Everything she'd built, the invisible life, the anonymity, the careful construction of a person nobody remembered, collapsing with the kind of efficiency that only institutions could manage. I saved his life, Katie said. And the hospital appreciates that, Helen replied, still not meeting her eyes. But we can't have nurses making independent medical decisions, regardless of the outcome. It sets a precedent. It opens us to liability. At 1400 hours, Katie's security badge was confiscated by a young guard who looked like he wanted to apologize but had been instructed not to make conversation. Her locker was emptied into a cardboard box, scrubs, shoes, the hand lotion she kept at the sink, the photograph of Marcus in his dress uniform that she'd kept turned face down so nobody would ask questions. The walk through the halls of Oak Creek Memorial transformed her from staff to invisible into something worse, a cautionary tale. Other nurses looked away. The doctor she'd worked alongside for 3 years suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. Security walked her to the parking lot like she was a threat that had been contained. The rain was coming down sideways, the kind of rain that hammered on pavement like applause for the wrong person. That night, Katie stood in the cemetery where they'd buried Marcus 7 years ago. The rain hadn't stopped. It felt like judgment, like punishment, like the universe reminding her that certain people don't get to live normal lives, no matter how hard they try. She clutched the faded green beret unit patch in her right hand, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining the day they'd told her he wasn't coming home. The patch was soft from 20 years of being touched, held, gripped during the moments when grip was all that remained. She knelt in the mud beside the grave marker that read his name, his rank, his dates, nothing else. I tried to start over, Katie whispered. The rain muffled her voice, which was good. Some words weren't meant to be heard. I tried to just be normal, Marcus. 12-hour shifts and payroll and people who didn't know my rank or what I'd done or why I woke up screaming at 0300. Where nobody expected anything except vital signs and medication rounds. Where I could forget the ones I couldn't save. But I failed. I failed again. She pressed the unit patch against her chest. The wool was damp. Everything was damp. Everything was dissolving. I shouldn't have been there. I shouldn't have saved him. I should have let the code team handle it, should have stayed invisible, should have understood that people like us don't get to pretend anymore. Once a warrior, always exposed. Once a senior chief, never just a nurse. Her hands were shaking now, but not from cold. I'm sorry. I tried so hard to be someone else. Someone safe. Someone forgettable. She stayed kneeling in the rain for 20 more minutes, the patch clutched tight, the gravestone blurring through tears that wouldn't stop coming. Around her, the cemetery stretched out in darkness, rows and rows of the dead, all of them having learned the same lesson at different times: the past doesn't forgive you for trying to escape it. The past simply waits. And then it comes. Somewhere in room for 18 of Oak Creek Memorial Hospital, Cole Brennan was sleeping the sleep of the saved, his oxygen saturation stable, his vital signs normalizing, his body healing from the trauma that would have killed him if not for a nurse who couldn't help being exactly what she was. He had no idea that the woman who'd just saved his life was the same woman who'd saved him 20 years ago in Ramadi, when she was somebody's savior instead of nobody's anything. He had no idea that within 24 hours, his memory would crack open the world. 24 hours after Katie pulled the needle between Cole's ribs and saved his life, he woke fully lucid. The machines around him had stopped their frantic singing. His breathing came easier now, oxygen saturation steady at 96%, his mind clear for the first time since the crash. A nurse named Marcus, no relation to Katie's late husband, but the coincidence hung heavy in the room, brought him the hospital incident report he'd requested. Cole read through the clinical language, the documentation of his near-death, searching for one name. He found it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. His hands went numb. The name detonated something inside him, a memory that had lived dormant for 20 years, buried under 2 decades of military advancement and careful forgetting. A female combat medic in Ramadi. A woman who'd thrown her body over his during a mortar attack on his village, who'd whispered, "I've got you, baby, I've got you," while his world burned around them. The memories came like shrapnel, the screaming, the dust, the weight of her body shielding him as rounds tore through the walls. She'd stayed with him for 6 hours until medevac arrived. He'd never seen her again. And she'd been at Oak Creek Memorial the entire time, pushing medication carts, reviewing charts, hidden behind scrubs and a quiet voice. The room tilted. Cole's hands trembled as he stared at that name printed in clinical black ink. Then his fingers reached for the call button. 2 hours later, the sky above Oak Creek Memorial split open with rotor wash. A Black Hawk helicopter descended through the cloud cover like a judgment falling from heaven, its presence so absolute it stopped traffic on the street below. The ground beneath the hospital entrance shook with the violence of its landing, that particular thrumming that makes your ribcage hum like a tuning fork. For Navy SEALs moved through the emergency department doors with the kind of synchronized precision that made civilians instinctively step back. These were men who'd walked through every variant of hell, their posture carried it like a second skeleton. They moved through the corridor with boots striking tile in perfect unison, the sound echoing off the walls like a countdown. They approached the nurses' station where Dr. Hargrove had emerged from a board meeting, his expression already arranging itself into defensive superiority. One of the SEALs, Commander Carson, built like a tactical refrigerator with scars that told their own operational history, spoke with the kind of voice that required no volume to command absolute authority. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. We need her. Not a request. Not negotiable. Dr. Hargrove's face went pale. I don't know who, we know she was terminated 24 hours ago. We need her now. The second SEAL was already moving toward the ICU, the third securing the perimeter, the fourth standing with his arms crossed, radiating the calm of someone who'd solved every problem through patient lethality. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth and closed it. He'd become used to being the authority in rooms. That era had just ended. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Katie was standing at a patient's bedside, not Cole's. She hadn't been allowed near him since her suspension, when someone tapped her shoulder. A SEAL she recognized instantly from the patch on his uniform, though she'd never met him before. Senior Chief Rodriguez. Come with me. Not a question. She followed, and when they reached Cole's room, the four poles rattled against the bed frame as orderlies wheeled it toward the door. Cole's eyes found hers. Tears streamed down his face like he was breaking from the inside out. Senior Chief, he whispered, his voice fractured, you're the one who saved me in Ramadi. The words hit Katie like a physical force. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw beneath the years, beneath the uniform and rank insignia that she could now see festooned his shoulders. She saw a terrified 8-year-old boy, huddled behind rubble while artillery rounds shook the earth itself. She'd memorized the faces of everyone she couldn't save. She'd never forgotten the few she had. Cole, she said quietly. That single word contained 2 decades of weight. Commander Carson stepped forward with a folder marked declassified across its face in bold red letters. He handed it to Katie with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious objects. Katie opened it. Her hands remained absolutely steady as she read, but her voice, when she spoke, came out rough as gravel. 2 bronze stars. Purple Heart. Navy Cross. Each citation she read aloud, her voice breaking just slightly on the last one, the Navy Cross citation detailing the moment she'd thrown herself over Cole Brennan during an ambush that had killed 4 personnel in her platoon. The Navy Cross. She'd never told anyone. She'd spent 3 weeks pushing medication carts in a hospital where no one knew her name, and the highest military recognition for valor had been sleeping in her garage, still in its original presentation case, untouched, unwanted. The SEAL commander turned to the assembled crowd. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire that something extraordinary was happening. Doctors, nurses, administrators, orderlies, custodians, everyone who had a moment had gravitated toward the ICU corridor. The room wasn't technically crowded, but it was full. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez earned 2 bronze stars for exceptional valor under fire. She earned a Purple Heart for wounds received while protecting personnel. And she earned a Navy Cross, the Navy's highest combat decoration, for shielding casualties under direct fire in Ramadi, Iraq, in 2004. She saved more lives than anyone in this building has even attempted to count. The silence was so profound it had texture. Then 2 figures in dark suits emerged from the elevator. Special Agents Williams and Torres. They walked with a particular gait of people who'd spent their careers delivering bad news and worse consequences. Dr. Mitchell Hargrove. Torres didn't wait for confirmation. We've been investigating Oak Creek Memorial's billing practices for 6 months. Your administrative access shows a pattern of procedure code inflation generating approximately $427,000 in fraudulent billing arrangements with 3 separate medical device manufacturers. Williams took over. Approximately $400,000 in kickback payments deposited to an offshore account under your mother's maiden name. Approximately 400,000 reasons to make problems disappear. At 2300 hours last night, you accessed the personnel management system and attempted to forge documentation regarding Ms. Rodriguez's employment termination. Federal crimes. Evidence tampering. Conspiracy. Torres held up a photograph. Your emails to the board members. Your messages to a private investigator you hired to build a case against Senior Chief Rodriguez. All of it documented. All of it admissible. Hargrove's face had gone from red to white to a grayish color that suggested his circulatory system was staging a coup. This is ridiculous. I'm a respected physician, you're a criminal, Williams said, in the way that only federal agents could flatten an entire life with 2 words. The handcuffs came out. They clicked onto Hargrove's wrists with the finality of a coffin closing. 2 uniformed officers appeared, Raleigh PD responding to the Bureau's call, and began walking him through the hospital corridors. Past the cafeteria where he'd knocked a tray from Katie's hands. Past the nurse's station where he'd made a $50 bet that she wouldn't last the month. Past every single staff member whose career he'd menaced or threatened or belittled. His perp walk was a gauntlet. His downfall was a parade. Katie watched with the kind of composure that only comes from having already survived the worst thing. One measured breath. No triumph. Just the quiet satisfaction of vindication delivered through the machinery of justice rather than her own hands. Helen Marsh, the HR investigator who'd been building a case against Katie on Hargrove's behalf, suddenly found urgent business in a supply closet. Board members who'd taken Hargrove's calls the previous day began claiming plausible deniability. The hospital's CEO appeared within minutes, visibly calculating liability and damage control. Cole reached for Katie's hand. His grip was firm despite his weakened state, anchored by something deeper than physical strength. After Ramadi, he said, after you saved me, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I joined the army at 18 because of you. Every success I had, every promotion, every day I served, I did it because you showed me what real courage looked like. You didn't cover me just to keep me alive. You covered me to tell me that I mattered. That I was worth protecting. Katie's composure, that carefully maintained wall she'd built over 20 years of silence, finally fractured. Tears streamed down her face, the kind of tears that come from releasing weight you've carried so long you forgot you were carrying it. 20 years of grief. 20 years of believing she'd failed. 20 years of hiding from the woman she'd been. Commander Carson produced the shadow box with the reverence of a man presenting a holy relic. Inside, that faded green Beret unit patch, the one that had lived in her jacket lining, that she'd touched 1,000 times in dark moments, now sat mounted professionally, surrounded by photographs from Ramadi, with an engraved plaque reading, "To the Angel of Ramadi, you taught me that courage looks like covering someone else." Katie stared at those words for what felt like a very long time. Then the hospital CEO materialized with an offer letter, reinstatement with a promotion, public apology, significant back pay. Katie took the paper, read it, then looked at the faces of the administrators who'd escorted her out 24 hours earlier with her badge confiscated and her reputation in flames. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. And something in the way she said those 4 words, measured, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who'd already survived the worst, made every person in that corridor understand that Katie Rodriguez had never actually needed them at all. 6 months later, the community college where Dr. Hargrove had plea bargained his way into minimum wage employment was holding its spring CPR certification class. Students barely registered his presence as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his medical license permanently revoked, his reputation cremated, his identity reduced to a footnote on a college roster. The mighty fallen to obscurity. Meanwhile, across Raleigh, the new VA hospital's emergency wing opened its doors. Katie Rodriguez stood in dress white Navy uniform, her official title now Senior Chief Petty Officer, Senior Patient Advocate and Emergency Protocols Director, watching veterans stream through the entrance. This was her kingdom now. A place where people understood that visible wounds were only half the story. A place where healing came from being seen by someone who'd also bled. The wing was dedicated to fallen combat medics. Katie had designed the protocol herself, the one that bridged the gap between military trauma and civilian medicine, using every lesson from Ramadi, channeling her scars into structures that would save others. General Brennan arrived for the ceremony. Cole's accelerated career, built on the foundation of courage that Katie had modeled for him 20 years ago, had culminated in stars on his shoulders that caught the light like promises. In front of assembled veterans, military brass, and medical staff, he did something that made the entire room draw breath. He knelt. Full dress uniform. General officer. He knelt before Katie and presented her with the shadow box. "To the Angel of Ramadi," he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. "You taught me that courage looks like covering someone else. You did that twice. Once in Ramadi when I was a child. And once 24 hours ago when you covered me from my own mistakes by standing still while everything fell apart around you. Katie's eyes shone, but her voice remained steady. General, please stand. You honored that lesson every day of your service. He rose, embraced her, and whispered, you gave me a life worth living, Senior Chief. Thank you. Katie walked the VA hospital corridors that evening, veterans nodding respect, her tremor finally gone, her purpose restored. The faded unit patch now hung framed on her office wall. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you're watching this, please hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories about the invisible heroes walking among us. Leave a comment telling us about someone you underestimated who turned out to be extraordinary.